is May the 4th. Happy Star Wars Day. Yes. And here's your joke. So how come Humpty Dumpty wasn't looking forward to winter? Because he had a great fall. Yes. All right. So for today, we're finishing the unit on the Civil War. So today will be the end of the notes for that. There's no additional homework, but I did assign a project. So that's also assigned on Google Classroom. I'm going to put a little video there to kind of explain that. All right. Also a reminder, there's an essay, a short essay, take-home essay coming up here as we conclude the Civil War. So get ready for that because that's coming soon. Yes. And basically, you'll be asked to look at the Civil War kind of from a Southern perspective and kind of their analysis and what they thought of the Civil War. All right, then. So with that, have a good, stay safe, stay smart. Happy May the 4th. So when Andrew Johnson begins vetoing legislation meant to support freedmen, the radical Republicans in Congress need to respond. And so what they come up with to basically counter Johnson's arguments that these laws that are being passed are unconstitutional is that they changed the Constitution. So the 13th Amendment is finally ratified, which actually had begun during Abraham Lincoln's time. And the 13th Amendment, quite simply, ends slavery. And then the 14th Amendment is passed. The 14th Amendment is again meant to counter the Black Codes. The 14th Amendment grants civil rights. Now, it doesn't say who specifically these civil rights are. It says that basically everyone's entitled to civil rights. It also establishes birthright citizenship. So if you're born here in the United States, you're entitled to citizenship. The other real interesting piece to the 14th Amendment, actually there's two other real interesting pieces to it. One is that rights are not listed. So it doesn't say specifically what these rights are, which allows those rights to evolve over time. So the 14th Amendment in 1866 is talking about blacks and former slaves, but the 14th Amendment in 2020 could be talking about the LGBTQ community. It could be talking about Muslim Americans. It could be talking about Asian Americans. It could be talking about anyone. And it certainly has been used over time by various minority groups to ask for, again, their civil rights. It will be the 14th Amendment, which the Supreme Court will use, says that there's a constitutional right to gay marriage. The other interesting piece about the 14th Amendment is that it shifts enforcement away from the states towards the national government. So when the Constitution was written, the fear was of a government, a strong government. If you look at the Bill of Rights is a list of things that the federal government cannot do to you. It doesn't say anything about the states because states were local. And so the thought was that states would look after their own individual citizens. What has happened now during Reconstruction is that the states are not looking after former slaves. They're not looking after those freedmen. So we can't trust the states to do what's right, hence those black codes. So now the federal government will be the one to kind of enforce these things. It's a completely different way of looking at the Constitution and constitutional rights. And the 14th Amendment, over the years, will be expanded even more to incorporate those federal protections as state protections as well. So when the South is told that, hey, we still have that 10% plan, right, where 10% of the population has to take that oath and then they're allowed to come back in, but you have to take that oath to uphold the Constitution. The Constitution now contains a 13th Amendment which ends slavery, which is not controversial. Everybody knew that slavery was not going to exist anymore. Everybody understood that. Everybody knew that's what the Civil War was truly about. The South lost, slavery is done. Everyone is okay with that. It's the 14th Amendment, though, which is problematic, granting blacks full rights, full citizenship, equal to whites. And that is just not palatable for white Southerners. And so the South refuses. They cannot accept these new constitutional amendments. And of course, if they refuse to uphold the Constitution, they refuse to accept these new amendments, well, then they cannot govern themselves. They're not going to come back into a state, which means if they're not going to come back into a state, they are a territory. And if they are a territory and they cannot govern themselves, then they need to be governed by the national government. And so Congress then will take over, and the radical Republicans get exactly what they want. So when states refuse to agree to the 14th Amendment, Congress takes over. And so what we have is something called the Reconstruction Act, or sometimes called the Military Reconstruction Act, because the South is going to be divided into 5 distinct military districts. The Army will return to the South, and the Army will govern. In addition, you now get a 15th Amendment. A 15th Amendment grants voting rights to African Americans. Again, just men and over the age of 21. And the 15th Amendment was seen as being important because there was no enforcement of the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment grants freedmen civil rights, but what if that doesn't happen? What if their local governments don't give them civil rights? Without the ability to vote, you can't hold those politicians accountable. Now that blacks have the ability to vote, they can vote out people that are not complying with the law. In addition, if you can vote, you can also run for office. And so radical Republicans see these 4 million former slaves as now voters. And who are they going to vote for? Are you going to vote for the Democratic Party? Or are you going to vote for the Republican Party that just won the Civil War and is run by abolitionists? You're going to vote Republican. And so former slaves now are seen as a reliable voting bloc and is seen as an excellent counterbalance to white Democratic Southerners. In terms of governing the South, you're going to need help to do this. So 2 groups of people kind of emerge, and we get 2 nicknames for these people, both of which are not very nice. So Southerners who help out in Reconstruction, Southerners who decide that they will participate in these new governments that are being created by the North, will help the military, they're called scallywags. Northerners who come south to assist are called carpetbaggers. Now, with the military in charge of governing the South, there's one problem. The President of the United States is Commander in Chief. He's in charge of the military. Andrew Johnson has shown that he is against radical Republican Reconstruction, and Andrew Johnson has shown that he wants to be more lenient towards the South. So Andrew Johnson plans to use the military not as a harsh instrument of revenge, as some in the North are looking at, but instead to carry out his policies, and he argues Lincoln's policies of forgiveness. Well, Thaddeus Stevens and the radical Republicans can't have that. So they pass a law called the Command of the Army Act, which removes the president as commander-in-chief. It allows Congress to name a commander-in-chief, and Congress names Ulysses S. Grant as commander-in-chief. And as Thaddeus Stevens says, that yes, the president is commander-in-chief, but Congress is his commander. Of course, this is blatantly unconstitutional. Andrew Johnson, of course, is going to veto this, and Congress is going to override that veto. Johnson's next ploy is to get rid of the Secretary of War. The Secretary of War, well, the argument, according to the president, goes, okay, if the president can't dictate and determine who's in charge of the military, well, then the Secretary of War must have that ability. So Johnson's like, all right, I will fire the Secretary of War, who is a holdover rather, from Lincoln's presidency, Edward Stanton. And so Johnson starts talking about firing him. Congress learns of this, and Congress passes a law called the Tenure of Office Act, which prohibits the president from unilaterally firing cabinet officials without the approval of Congress. Again, blatantly unconstitutional. Johnson sees this as unconstitutional, fires Secretary of War anyway. The Secretary of War, for his sake, refuses to leave his office. He actually padlocks the door and basically lives inside his office for a good bit of time um, while all this is going on. But Johnson has broken a law, and once the president breaks a law, he can then be impeached, which is exactly what the radical Republicans wanted. So Congress passes articles of impeachment. They are universally, um, overwhelmingly supported by the House of Representatives. It then goes to the Senate. The trial is held in the Senate, and in the Senate, Andrew Johnson is acquitted. He is found innocent by one vote. A senator from Kansas by the name of Edmund Ross changes his vote at the last minute, with the idea being that I don't like Andrew Johnson. I don't like the man, but he didn't do anything wrong. And the idea that impeachment is not a sword, but impeachment is a shield. Impeachment is not to be used as a weapon against politicians that we don't like. Instead, impeachment is supposed to be used as a shield to protect us from politicians who are corrupt or do other illegal actions. Of course, all this is happening in 1868. It is the end of Andrew Johnson's term. He is not going to run for re-election. And so Andrew Johnson leaves office, and Ulysses S. Grant runs for the presidency in 1868. And he overwhelmingly wins in 1868 and will serve for 2 terms. We'll talk a little bit more about his presidency with our next unit. So we'll skip ahead here after those 8 years to the election of 1876. In the election of 1876, we had Rutherford B. Hayes, who was the Republican candidate from Ohio. He's the gentleman you see at the top there of the screen, versus Samuel Tilden, a Democrat of New York, who kind of looks like a human turtle. So this is an interesting election because Reconstruction is the issue. Republicans say they will continue with Reconstruction. The Democrats want to bring it to an end. Tilden, on election night, has 184 electoral votes. Rutherford B. Hayes has 165. The thing is, though, you need 185, so Tilden is 1 vote short with 20 disputed votes. And those 20 disputed votes, nobody knows who actually won those disputed votes. To this day, we don't know who truly won those votes. We have corruption on both sides. So now what do? So a compromise has to be reached. And so we have an informal compromise, which is known as the Compromise of 1877. And so all 20 disputed votes will go to Rutherford B. Hayes. And so Rutherford B. Hayes is going to win the presidency with a tally of 185 to 184. He wins by 1 electoral vote. And in return, what do the Democrats get? They get an end to Reconstruction. And with an end to Reconstruction, the soldiers go home and the South is allowed to govern as they want. And it brings an end to Reconstruction. And with the military gone, and with the federal government oversight gone, there's nobody now to protect African Americans. There's nobody there to protect blacks. There's nobody there to enforce the 14th Amendment. There's nobody there to enforce the Civil Rights Act. And what we get now is a huge backslide in the rights of African Americans in the United States. This is the beginning of all those Jim Crow laws. This is the beginning of segregation laws. And this is the beginning of that type of system, which will be in place all the way through up for another century. And it'll take Martin Luther King in the 1950s and the 1960s to fight for the enforcement of the laws that are already on the books, meaning that Civil Rights Act and the 14th Amendment. So with the end of Reconstruction, it does kind of represent a lost opportunity. There was a chance here to rebuild the country after the Civil War and to rebuild it in a way that was truly colorblind. And this idea of liberty and justice for all. But unfortunately, that does not occur. It's one of the great tragedies of American history. And so you could make a solid argument that the South, yeah, they lost the Civil War, they lost the battles of the Civil War, but they kind of, in the long run, wound up winning.